With the Partnership for Economic Policy, I'm very happy to be co-hosting this meeting, especially being from Nairobi. We've communicated with a lot of you, and I do hope that you traveled safe, and those who are still traveling will join us. Just to say a little bit, Partnership for Economic Policy, PEP, as you can see over there, the orange logo, it's a global NGO registered in the US as a charitable organization, but headquartered in Nairobi. Our core focus is capacity building, research, and policy engagement, really ensuring that research and policy go together in a co-production model, but also, most important, we position ourselves as the go-to think tank that is focusing on participation. I want to thank you again very much for finding time to come for this workshop, to dedicate time to prepare for the same, focusing on multilateral development bank reform and African priorities. I know you are all working in this area. And I would want to begin by recognizing our convening partners that you can see in the background there. We have the African Center for Economic Transformation, ACET, based in Ghana. Please just raise up your hand if you are representative of that institution. As I mentioned, the Center for Global Development, CGD, based in the US and UK. And thank you, CGD, for bringing us together. We will not be here if it were not for you. Then we have the Policy Center for the New South, PCNS, based in Morocco. Let's see you. We have REPOA, based in Tanzania. Let's see you. Last and not least, PEP. Please raise your hand. Partnership for Economic Policy. Thank you. I think there's one more. I don't know whether he missed his flight, but we're expecting someone from Pakistan as well. Most important, we're also very grateful to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. BMGF, do we have anyone from Bill and Melinda Gates? No, I know one of them wrote to me at night saying the flight was delayed, so they are still on their way. Then Open Society Foundation. We had one person last night, maybe he's still on the way. We really appreciate them. Can we applaud for them for supporting this event? And we thank them for that. We are pleased to be hosting this workshop alongside the African Development Bank annual meetings. I hope you've been to some of the sessions there. The African Development Bank has been a leader on reform, as you know, especially in innovative finance, as exemplified by the introduction of hybrid capital to help expand lending operations. AFDB is a vital partner for this region, which is facing profound challenges due to a combination of external events, as we know, perhaps starting with the global pandemic, though it's now behind us, and now including high commodity prices, the triple crisis that we are talking about, a high interest rate environment. We have the deteriorating debt dynamics, and an increase in the frequency and intensity of shocks that we can think about, and also climate-related disasters. Just to mention a few, I think we all know the kind of shocks that we are facing, and some of them you are actually addressing in your research. As a result of these shocks, the development and poverty reduction gains of the previous decade are at risk of being erased. So we need to do everything possible that we can to ensure that this does not happen. So over the last 2 years, there has been a wide-ranging effort to reform MDBs to better enable them to help countries meet these challenges. However, much of the conversation has been dominated by donor countries rather than by citizens, institutions, governments in the South, and also think tanks. And that's why you have this opportunity now. For those who know, the Heads of State event hosted by our beloved President for Kenya, President Ruto, last month, was a step in redressing this imbalance, as the region's leaders were given the opportunity to publicly make the case for generous financing from the World Bank. Today, we hope to continue this dialogue with think tanks, all of you, civil society organizations, MDB officials, and government officials. I do hope we have government officials here. Together, we will explore specific issues at the center of MDB reform. Okay? So, how are we structuring our day today? We will begin the day with a plenary session. I hope you've all seen the agenda. That will further explore the impact of global economic trends on low-income countries. This will be followed by several breakout sessions, a luncheon, and a closing plenary. All of this is detailed in the agenda. Finally, I would like to turn to Good Mo to open the plenary session. Mr. Mo, where are you? Raise up your hand there. Please come over here. Please come. Mr. Mo is a senior policy fellow at the CGD, where he focuses on governance, infrastructure, finance, and Africa's response to the changing landscape of external actors. Mr. Mo is also a lecturer at the University of Chicago and previously served as Liberia's Minister of Public Works. Wow. Thank you all for coming. And to our online audience, who are tuning in for the plenary session, I wish all of us a very fruitful day, very interactive, and thank you.
Thank you. The panelists just come up, right? Yes. Okay, so panelists, please come up, and then we'll introduce you once you've... Sorry about that. Morning, everybody, and welcome to this opening plenary and obviously the esteemed panel. I will introduce them. I will start with Mavis Owusu. Is it soft G? Jamfi. She's currently Executive Vice President of ASSET, the Africa Center for Economic Transformation, but as of July, she would be the next president. Congratulations, Madam President. ASSET is a Pan-African Economic Policy Institute supporting Africa's long-term growth through transformation. Welcome, Mavis. Next is Sarah Maka. She's the One Campaign's Executive Director for Africa, where she leads One's advocacy and strategic engagement for the continent. Good morning and welcome. And at the far end is Ms. Hannah Ryder. Hannah is the CEO and founder of Development Reimagined, which is pioneering African-led, women-led international development consultancy. Ladies, welcome. I have some remarks, but I have to read them. And just sort of set the table for our conversation. So recently, the World Bank released this report that said that globally, the global poor bore the brunt of economic scarring from the pandemic, and that incomes fell across the poorest countries more than they did in the rich countries. As a result of income losses, the world's poorest were twice as high. The income losses of the world's poorest were twice as high as the world's richest, and global inequality rose for the first time in decades. Those losses were more pronounced in sub-Saharan Africa, where incomes are falling further behind the rest of the world. We're hoping that our conversation here will be able to set the stage for what will happen for the rest of the day. When I was in government, we came into government at the end of a civil war. Everything was broken, everything was destroyed. And because of that, every single thing was a priority. So the government was forced to make a priority list out of existing priorities. It seems as if we found ourselves, especially for low-income countries, in a position like that again, where every single thing is a priority. And when we think about what the agenda for MDBs should be, well, we have to make a list out of a list of priorities. So I wanted to begin by giving the panelists an opportunity. What are the challenges? If you were to create this list, what would be on your list and why? I will start with you, Mavis.
Thank you, Gwede, and thank you, colleagues, for this opportunity. So I was thinking about what would be on my list for prioritization, and starting from the point you made around poverty and the importance for us to think about how we make our way out of poverty. I think for me, number one would be for our leaders to really push for MDB balance optimization. Balance sheet optimization. And it's great that they started doing that. But if you look at what the World Bank has done thus far, it's very much on IBRD, so, which is mostly for middle income countries. So what happens when you're sitting in Africa? We need to think out of the box on how we increase concessional financing like IDA and the ADF. How do we get more money into those instruments? Because without concessional financing, honestly, we are just spinning. We need access to more concessional finance. So the first thing I'd be doing would be pushing the MDBs to think out of the box on concessional financing. The second thing I would be looking at is where they invest that money, priority investment. I'm often worried that when we think about emergencies, we forget the underlying foundations that causes that emergency. So you can't think about more money without thinking through what you're going to use that money for. So I would be pushing African governments to really push MDBs to invest in the types of initiatives that will lead to transformative growth. That's really, really critical. And I think our message would be, well, World Bank, AFDB, you are great in emergencies, okay? It's amazing how quickly they mobilize it in emergency. This is an emergency. So that would be my number two priority, investing in transformative growth to lay the foundations for the future and to deal with today's problems. The third would be how international IFIs work with African MDBs and African financial institutions. We've got to look at this whole thing as a holistic process. And we've got to, because if African financial institutions can better leverage the global system, once our governments are stable enough, we can start to realize the ambitions that President Akufo-Addo made recently, about 30% of our balance sheets being invested in these organizations to grow and enhance our investments. The fourth one, he said, what were my priorities? He didn't give me a number, so I'm just giving you my 5 priorities very quickly.
Do it.
Very quickly. My fifth one is a seat at the table. Thank you, World, for giving AU a seat at the table. We really appreciate it, but it's not good enough. We really want a conversation on quotas and voting shares. So Development Reimagined have done some fantastic work on what quotas and voting shares should look like for Africa. Not for LICs, not for any other structure, but for Africa. And then we were in a discussion where we were told, this is really great work, but the geopolitics is tough. Not good enough. Just not good enough. Let's push. Let's really push for that conversation to be held and for a fairer system to be provided for Africa alongside the world fighting its geopolitics. And finally, I will say to our African leaders, if we are all going to work on pushing this, you need to show that we're not going to get back to this place again, which means starting to put in place some of the fundamentals around, you know, responsible fiscal management, legal and policy frameworks for responsible debt management and debt use, thinking through domestic savings and laying the foundations for domestic resource mobilization. Lots of countries are talking about how they are increasing DRMs. They are squeezing the tiny middle class. There are lots of technological ways to broaden the net. Let's demonstrate that we are serious about not getting back here by putting some of these systems in place. It was really hard to pick 5. And I had lots of others, but I've stuck to 5.
We might bring some others up. You'll bring some. We might do. You know, I have a mic here with me. Oh, okay.
Thank you, Mavis. We'll go to Sarah now for another 7 things on the list.
I'll make that 10. I actually wanted to start where Mavis ended. So to take a step back, I think the state of play, the global outlook, many countries are grappling with similar things, right? So the scale of which they're grappling is different, but we know sort of the interest rates challenges, the inflation challenges across the board, cost of living across the board. So when we look inward and low-income economies in Africa as a proxy, we think about the global financial architecture, because that effectively says what are the sources of revenue for low-income countries, for African countries. But I think we can't have a conversation about sources of revenue without having uses of revenue. And that's the complete picture of the global financial architecture, what we're fighting for. But I'll focus on the sources of revenue. And I wanted to start with, on the immediate term, is concessional finance, as you mentioned. I mean, I think given where we are with IDA and ADF coming, those are really important sources of concessional financing. But if we look at the need, the numbers are pretty astronomical. So for Africa, for SDGs, $1.3 trillion. If you look at all of low-income countries, put together $4 trillion. Then we look at the scale of concessionality, which is not the be-all and end-all, but IDA is asking for 120 best case, which seems impossible, but let's see, 100 billion. ADF is going big this year, and big next year means 25. So what do we have, 145 billion, if best case scenario, which looks a little shaky, to be honest. But that's 145 of what we need of 1.3 trillion on the continent. So we can't stop there. It feels to me like the global financial architecture conversation is about what part of the elephant are you touching. But for us to move this thing forward, we have to move the whole elephant forward. So we have the concessionality, which is number 1. The second is illicit financial flows. So this goes back to DRM, because domestic resources, I'll come to that as my third, is important, but the scale of leakage we have in illicit financial flows of 88.9 billion, 88.6 billion every year is pretty significant. So what if we plug that hole? And currently there are efforts to plug that hole through the international tax treaty, because those impact how African countries domestically can actually raise funds, because once a multinational enters your jurisdiction, all of a sudden you're engaging in international tax treaties. And what we're finding is those tax treaties actually benefit developed countries. When a developing country and developed country come face to face on taxes, we lose out. So how do we make that more equal? And there's a whole conversation in the UN to try and create some kind of framework convention that makes it a bit more equal so we have more voice. So that's illicit financial flows, that's taxation, all around DRM. The third is DRM fully. 20 years ago, we're talking about debt. 20 years later, we're talking about debt. In 20 years, are we going to be talking about debt? Like, at some point, we need to stop talking about debt. So how do we plug it? So in 20 years, we're not talking about debt again. What are the fundamental challenges with the structure that has this cyclical, every generation, we come back to the same conversation? God forbid my children gather in this place in the next 20 years having the same conversation we're having. So how do we fix it? And the fix, some efforts are going on credit rating agencies and how we price Africa's debt. But that's one part of it. The other part is, how do we add value to what we have on the continent? Where do we get a consensus across the continent that indeed we must add revenue, we must add value to our revenue so we get more? And I do think there's a moment in time with climate transition, the green transition, that African countries can really ride this wave of adding value and increasing our revenue base. And I think I'll add, in addition to that, two more things. One is remittances, and I know we don't talk about this a lot, but remittance is about 100 billion for African countries. I keep this like bean counter in my head. I'm trying to tally to 1.3 trillion because that's the goal, right? So I'm counting 145, I have 100 here, I have 88.9 billion here. We're still far from a 1.3 trillion. DRM should be 75 to 90% of a country's profile of revenue, but we're not there yet on the continent. So how do we increase our revenue profile to get to 75 to 90% of our revenue generated internally? Remittance is about 100 billion, and we're seeing a lot of diaspora motivation and action happening. Yet we know that remitting money back home has a cost element to it, especially to the continent. So is there room for us to tackle that reform on the cost of sending money home? Because while remittances is diffuse, it's hard for governments to kind of put their arms around it. It is in volumes, and it's helping to kind of cushion what people are feeling. Nigeria, for example, inflation rate is about 33% this month, which means every day you go to the store, the price of food has increased. How people are surviving, the individual, is really hard. So those remittances actually make a difference. How do we ensure that the flows come in while we take care of other gushing challenges they're working on? And I think the last one I'll talk about is sort of foreign direct investment. This one, again, has fallen. The reform element of FDI is more tied to taxation because there's an interesting balance where African countries want to attract FDI, but they also don't want to sell out some tax revenue because they're trying to attract, make these deals more lucrative for multinationals coming in. But I think maybe to sum up, we have a roadmap. Agenda 2063 is a roadmap, so it's not a question of roadmap. There is a question of coordination. I think there's 71 different reforms on global financial architecture when we last counted. Yes, when you said everything was a priority, it feels like 71 different reforms. Where do we start with? How do we categorize what's required? I do think we need a subset of them that we can do in the short term, in the medium term, in the long term. But the goal is that we're fixing some systemic financial, architectural, structural reforms. So again, we don't come back here in 20 years talking about where Africa is and its lack of resistance to the shocks that are coming at it.
Thank you.
Okay, so my list is only 4. But I'm going to, I'll kind of give an opening as to why these. And I think when we're thinking about priorities, quite often when it comes to MDBs, the easiest thing to look at is amounts, right? And it's easiest for presidents or prime ministers, advocates in general, to be, okay, we want this amount. But I think one of the points is that a key issue is that we need to go well beyond that. We can't just have MDB reform, which is just about let's increase capital. Yes, that's important, but there's also a number of structural changes and issues with MDBs that needs to be tackled. And so in terms of for African governments, what we have to realize is that many of the challenges that governments are facing now are the reason why we're having some of these conversations again is to do with that system that MDBs are locked into. And so you're not going to get out of this system, you're not going to get out of this cycle if you don't change those fundamentals. So we have to change the fundamentals as well as increasing capital. So while capital definitely should be an important aspect of it, and I think it's important, again, from an African perspective, to remember that 100 billion, even 120 billion, is not an increase in absolute terms. Effectively, in terms of for IDA. IDA has been declining overall, so it would not actually lead to an overall increase in terms of what countries get, knowing that African countries do, of course, get around 75% of IDA. So that's not really ambitious. So we need to kind of work out, what does ambition look like from an African perspective? What do we need? Even if it might not be what we get, we still need to say what that is. So that's number one priority. Number two is, in terms of thinking about kind of how MDBs operate, it's also what do MDBs prioritize? Now, AFDB, we're here on the sidelines of the African Development Bank meetings, 60-year-old institution, excellent, great, celebrating its anniversary. And one of the great things about AFDB is it has been really helpful with regards to infrastructure, which is obviously a major priority. Judah, you talked about everything kind of being gone in Liberia. Well, yes, that's your infrastructure is not there, and we still really lag very, very behind. Just to give you an example, for Kenya, we have looked at what it would take for Kenya to make sure that every single person had access to the internet, had access to 100% electricity and transport, just, you know, a basic level. And that would take Kenya spending at least 14 to 21 billion US dollars every year, which of course is going to hit debt sustainability ceilings, etc. And again, that explains just why concessional finance, because of your ability to pay long term, is just so important, low interest, etc. So I think trying to find ways of providing concessional finance for infrastructure, MDB's doing that more. IDA only spends less than 50% on kind of physical infrastructure, if that. And one of the reasons why infrastructure is so important is because it delivers what we would call, the economists in the room, endogenous growth. Right? So it's a productive asset, productive and effectively a public good. And that's where governments really need support. Domestic resource mobilization, of course, people want to see their own taxes going into the health system. They want to see their own taxes going into education. But where you reach out for external finance, that's where you can really create some really important public goods that will last for a very long time and generate goods on their own. So I think that's the second priority. Make sure MDBs are spending a lot more on infrastructure, public goods that will generate growth, that will be assets. The third one, and again coming back to these sort of structural issues, is that I guess one could call them the techie things. I don't know how else to describe it. There are a number of things that the multilateral development banks do and have in their toolbox, which structurally create barriers to, for example, financing infrastructure or being able to get more concessional finance. Think about the thresholds for IDA and IBRD. So we have an infographic coming out which shows the number of countries that have graduated from IDA. Several of them have ungraduated back in, right? And what is the point of having what is the point of the threshold? It creates constraints. There is actually a disincentive as to become a middle-income country, because as soon as you become a middle-income country, you're then paying extra in terms of your finance. So there's reasons why you might not declare extra GDP, because if you declare, you can't access IDA or you can't access ADF. So there's, you know, a whole set of very strange, systemic, techie things that MDBs have that are fundamental to how African governments, countries engage with the MDBs, and they need reform too. And things like debt sustainability frameworks, you know, all of those come in there. And last but not least, going back to what Mavis was talking about, voice and decision making has to be fundamental to this. Those things won't be resolved in the long term and won't be able to be flexibly improved over time unless African governments have more voice in the institutions. Of course, African governments do have the maximum voice that we have in the AFDB and decision-making power in the AFDB. That's still limited due to board structures, which also, of course, themselves need reform. But at the same time, there is so much work to be done with regards to our 80-year-old cousins, the IMF and World Bank. So hopefully that's also something that can be worked on.
Thank you. So part of what we're trying to do here, of course, is establish this landscape of the challenges we face and an inadequacy of the MDB system to deliver on those and the priorities of how the reforming those things will look like. Maybe we discussed this today or not, but of all of the MDBs, the African Development Bank has this structure where it is owned by the borrowers, unlike, say, the Inter-American Development Bank or the Asian Development Bank. And to some extent, that structure has meant, has placed significant limitations on how big the African Development Bank can actually be. So, do we as Africans give up more control of the African Development Bank so that we can increase the amount of money that's available, or do we retain our independence and continue to hold on to our borrower ownership of the bank so that we control what it says? I don't know. I was just putting that out there. But I wanted to give each of the panelists an opportunity now to respond to what they heard. Each panelist had a list. Mavis had 17. Sarah had like 10, and Hannah had like 8. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to what you heard the other panelists say concerning the list of priorities as we think of, and this time let's start with you, Sarah, and then we'll do Hannah, and then we'll come to Mavis.
It's hard to, I call it where to start peeling the tape from. You need a little hook to start peeling this thing from. I think the heat is around concessionality and MDB reform. That's where the heat is. So I do think it needs to be on the table. I think consolidating that, I think IDA has potential to triple its own base to $279 billion by 2030, and IBRD has about, if the balance sheet can be optimized, about $500 billion. I'm still a little concerned that a lot of low and middle income countries are ceding the driving seat of their development to the external world. So until we're able to find the representation areas where we fundamentally change the system, it feels to me that the graduation, as you mentioned, and then the on-graduation will keep happening. IDA in 1970s was focused on Asia. Asia no longer needs IDA. Africa is the place of heat for IDA. I hope in 20 years, Africa will no longer, I think we need an exit strategy off of these concessional pots of funding, as important as they are today. But I think if we're not creating a fix for the long term, what we have is this cycle of dependence on the structures that predated Africa's existence as independent countries. And so the journey for us really should be, the second place of heat should be, how do we unlock systemic areas that prevent full participation so that those systems align with our economies? For example, the International Tax Treaty, the history of it is 1920. That's when, and it still adheres to the principle and standards of the 1920s. We're in 2024, and we're still fighting the battle of, we want more voice in tax treaties, international tax treaties. Like, those are the things we need to be able to harness. The G20, the AU of the G20 is only as good as we use it. So again, it's no good for us to fight to get these things, and then we kind of leave value on the table by not utilizing it to its core. So I think that's where my mind is at. There's so much swirl, there's so much we can do, but can we need to identify the things that are immediate, which is concession and concessional funding, and we can see it clear as day. but we then need to pivot and maybe concurrently work on the things which are systemic so that we can be in the driver's seat and prevent our cyclical conversations.
Thank you.
Yeah, so would we in... So I think I take us. So I want to come to your question afterwards, Jude. But I think I take a slightly different view in terms of when coming back to this question in 20 or 40 years. We were talking about 40 years yesterday, but coming back in 20 years, because I think again we've got to come back to this point. Debt is not bad. Taking out, having lending, borrowing in general is not bad. It is what you borrow for, and also at the rate at which you borrow. So, as individuals, it's expected, in a functioning economy, so let's say a functioning multilateral system, and multilateral, where we have ownership, that there will be individuals who take mortgages all the time, but they'll be 25 years plus, they'll be able to repay, and so on. So, and while they've got their mortgage, they'll be doing things that grow. And I think part of the issue is that we've almost stigmatized borrowing to such a degree that we actually want to get out of it completely. I don't think we have to, but we do need to get out of the cycle. And that's where the concessionality is so important, but also some of these other structural features. With regards to AFDB and decision-making, how to increase capital. I think, of course, having more capital from African countries is important. And definitely we should be trying to stretch as far as we can, because we're investing into an organization that is AAA rated, can therefore get finance at a much cheaper rate than we can on our own. That's the benefit of it. And also can do potentially some very innovative things like regional financing. It has some incentives for regional financing. We can come back to this question about how to strengthen those incentives. But I think, the AFDB definitely, as an African institution, can play a great role. But at the same time, we have to remember that there is always, and there's a bigger opportunity cost to our countries putting in more capital into the bank than getting that finance from others who have more capital available to put into productive asset classes like a multilateral. So when we put money in there, the opportunity cost is that money can't be used for something else, and that's our people who are poorer than everybody else. The average African has a much lower GDP per capita than the average, American or Chinese person. So those countries putting in more money, or Brits putting in more money, is going to be easier for them. But at the same time, I think we can also separate out decision making from finance. We've already got arrangements that do that in the AFDB. The UK, the High Commissioner to Zambia was talking about this last week. The UK is the 14th largest shareholder in the African Development Bank, has a shareholding of something like 1.7%, or maybe just under 2% anyway. It has got a seat on the executive board. So that means just for 180 million, I think it's US dollars a year, the UK gets to have gets to wield quite a lot of power in terms of decision making at the AFDB. So maybe those are the things like board structure doesn't have to be related to, and it actually isn't related to shareholding necessarily. So those are the things that we can consider, some creative options around that.
Can I just add one thing on ADF? So this year, potentially next year for ADF wants to go to the capital market just like IDA went to the capital market. So that's another opportunity for innovation to get to 25 billion. So I just wanted to, and a plug that we're having an event on ADF today at 3:30. So come hear more about it.
Love it, Sarah. So
I think the reason my 20 went to 10 to 8 is the interconnectedness of the issues. So, you know, I made my number 2 priority how the money is invested. And I said it must be invested in transformative growth. Hannah talked about the importance of investing it in infrastructure. We can debate that later. But I think the issues are so interconnected. You know, I talked about the importance of concessional finance. Sarah talked about concessional finance is critical now, but we've got to think about how it leverages others and think about the whole basket of financial tools available to us, and how do we leverage off each other? How do we make the different tools work for what we need right now? So I actually don't feel like we necessarily disagreed on anything. We probably came to very similar points from very different entry points. If there was one thing that we probably didn't talk about enough, and I didn't say this because I really thought Sarah was going to say it, was the whole issue of regional collaboration, okay? If we do absolutely nothing as a continent, we must work together in fixing these issues. And I think that's the only way we can stop ourselves from sitting here in 40 years, because we are all trying to tackle these issues individually as countries. We go on global platforms and we talk about the 5 priorities that matter to Africa. Then we go into bilateral rooms and have bilateral conversations. And we've got to be much better at saying, when we look at concessional finance, these are the things that matter most to us, and everybody repeats the same thing. When we are looking at IDA and ADF priorities, it's great that we're all talking about economic transformation. You know, ASET is mega happy about it. It's everywhere, economic transformation right now. But what do we actually mean by economic transformation? Do we have a tight definition of it when we go into these rooms? When we talk about infrastructure, and we talk about, are we talking about infrastructure out? Or are we talking about connecting each other with each other, okay? When we talk about value addition, okay, countries out there don't care about our value added products. Let's be honest about it. They care about our raw materials. But our value added products matter to us, okay? So why is it that this fabric, so I keep doing this and it really irritates people, but I'm going to do it again. This outfit I'm wearing, probably with this outfit as well, okay? The cotton came from somewhere on the continent, okay? It got shipped to Southeast Asia to be processed. Then we bought it back, and then we printed it. Or we sent, you know, or I don't know, Holland bought it and printed it. Then we buy it back. Then we make the clothes, okay? And then we buy some of the fabric back and we make the shirts and stuff that you are wearing. Then we ship it to Europe. And then when they get bored, they send it back to us as second-hand clothes and dump it, okay? Does that make sense to anybody? Because our whole economy is outward looking. Whereas, imagine Mali shipping that cotton to Ghana, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, processing those textiles, okay? That textile is shipped to East Africa. East Africa produces the shirts and blouses, etc. That goes to Europe and North America. West Africa factories use the same textiles, print it, send it to the fashion houses in West Africa, ship it out to the rest of Africa or wherever. Or send it to South Africa to be printed into fabrics, or send it to East Africa to be printed to Kanga. What's stopping us from doing that? So we ship out, ship in, ship out, ship in. There's something fundamentally wrong. So if the infrastructure you're talking about is about that, it works. But I can bet you your bottom dollar that right now there's a minister sitting in front of a bilateral agency talking about the infrastructure from their port to their city to a village somewhere. So these are some of the things that they need to talk about, that collaboration.
Well, thank you, Mavis. Can I use that? This is testing. Wait, this works. That was interesting, Mavis. Sorry. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation, because we have these lists and there is some convergence in the themes that the different panelists highlighted. But I'll come back to this point to say that resilience is actually a function of pre-existing strength, right? How resilient a person or an economy is a function of how much strength was in the economy before the crisis. And so our ability to be resilient to external and internal shocks require us to be strong before. Many African finance ministries spent down on reserves responding to COVID. Then we had Ukraine and all of its impact on the global economy. Obviously, now we have Gaza, and internationally, the global international system and attention functions like a cat and a laser. It can only focus on one thing at a time. And so once Gaza began to happen, all of the oxygen is sucked out of the room. I'm raising this to say that we have this list of priorities, but we face a world where attention is very, very limited, which means we got to do the thing that we did in Liberia. If we had to come up with a list, to Sarah's point, it can't be 71. It can't be 21. So if we're now forced to have to come up with a list that is more restrained because of the difficulty we face, more importantly, a lot of the donors are now beginning to spend, at least in Europe, they're beginning to spend money at home and count that as development financing, especially what's happening in Ukraine. So can we go back now that we don't have an unlimited budget in terms of the things we can have on our list, and say, okay, instead of 5 Mavis, let's go with 2 each, so that at the end of the day, the list that we're looking at when we're thinking about MDB reform or interacting with the rest of the world is actually 6. It's not 71. It's not 20. Let's start with Hannah, and then we'll come back to each.
I've got 2.
Okay, I will focus on. I think it has to be voice. Well, decision-making power, not voice. Decision-making power and amounts. So decision-making power, I think, is one where there is a very kind of clear story to be able to tell, and if that is the early outcome, then that can enable the space for other outcomes to be achieved, because if you have more decision-making power, you can then help to make sure those things get done and the other changes get done. So I think I would put that as top priority, in fact, because it enables everything else. But then the second one would be amount of finance going into the MDBs for Africa specifically. And so, of course, increase for ADF, increase for IDA. And I think the pitch is that multilateral spending enables things like regional spending. It enables countries to do joint submissions, for example. It enables pooling of risk, what I talked about in terms of rating and so on. So it enables much lower interest rates versus bilateral spending. And also from the Treasury point of view of those who do spend and put money into the MDBs, it's definitely less overhead compared to managing bilaterals. And those those arguments have always been made. It's just that I think the arguments around national interest have started to become much higher, and so that's why you've seen a lot of countries, a lot of donor countries, use the national interest argument to be able to kind of start to put spend into bilateral, and also then, you know, be able to kind of find loopholes that enable them to spend money on refugees at home and so on. So yeah, I would make a much stronger pitch for why multilateral finance versus bilateral finance of your available spend. And I think also in the time of challenging geopolitics, should we say, I think being seen to be generous internationally, I think, is also very important, and in the national interest, fundamentally. So I think there's a stronger case to be made there.
So voice and volume, absolute amount of money that's available. Sarah?
Yeah. This works. This does not work. Okay, I think it does. Okay. Can you hear me okay? No.
These Hannah's.
Two, I love the fact, Jude, you're like, was that cat on a laser? You want to make sure we're making just 2 points. I think, for me, my two would be concessionality of funds and courage. So the first on concessionality of funds is because it's what's required now. But it can also be really catalytic if Africa deploys it well. And courage, the second point, is really around the courage of African leaders to implement the things, and Mavis set me up for this beautifully, that foster continental free trade area. Because at the end of the day, resilience, as you mentioned earlier, being a function of sort of our past strength, many economies might not have had that resilience, but we can start growing it. So we don't pigeonhole ourselves and say, well, if you weren't resilient before, you can't be resilient in the future. I do think the continental free trade area has some really important leverage points for Africa. The first, it is tests, what will you transport, what will you ship across the continent? We're still doing, 14% trade internally, and we've just built the largest free trade area. If we increase that by a few folds, and kudos to the continental free trade area for testing trading between 8 countries and finding them as falling short. It took 6 months for tea to get from Kenya to Ghana, an indictment. But at least they said, okay, this 6 months is too long. Now it's opened up the guided trade areas, and they're trying to figure out, okay, what does it take? And what it takes is infrastructure to make sure that the pathway of the infrastructure is not necessarily the road to my village, but where's the pathway that wheat from Ethiopia gets to the rest of Africa? Now let's build that pathway out so that Ethiopia can actually ship some wheat to other parts of Africa. Where's the pathway for rice to get from Nigeria and a few other countries to the rest of Africa? If we test and kick the tires in the continental free trade area, we will start investing with our concessional funding in these areas that are going to promote more productive, and the name of the game is more resilient economies. So if I could settle on two, it would be the concessional funding that can be catalytic and the courage to implement the continental free trade area.
Thank you. And just to show you how decisive women are, okay, I'd like to echo the point that my sisters have made on we need more concessional finance. And then the second one, I think, really builds on Sarah's point as well, which is, and I'm articulating it as invest in, the type of transformational growth that the region needs. And Gude, you talked about how, as a continent, were we resilient before these shocks? The Africa Transformation Index showed we weren't. So the Africa Transformation Index, which is an asset product, looked at 30 countries across the continent, and they represent 86% of the continent's GDP. And we have been regressing on transformation for a very long time. We looked at the countries that were performing well and saw that after the financial crisis, they actually rebounded faster than the others that were not transforming pre the financial crisis. So there is a link, a direct correlation between transforming your economies and actually being resilient. So for me, if we don't think about transformative growth, if we don't think about how we are diversifying economies, enhancing productivity, export competitiveness, all of those things, this will be a constant vicious cycle. So, to be clear, we've come up with 3 in total. You gave us 6. We've ended up in 3. Just wanted to let you know.
Listen, fair enough. So, maybe the women should run things. But
Why maybe? I mean, what is the maybe about?
Oh.
Really?
The women should run things. No, maybe. We had this joke that it wasn't true, but we say that because my boss was a woman, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and every new hire we asked, how do you feel about being fired by a woman? But I wanted to talk a bit, and with 20 minutes to go, we're going to open up for audience questions. So if you have a question or comment.
We're at 15 minutes to go.
Oh, my bad. We're at 15 minutes to go, so we should, just before the audience question, and then maybe I will say this, and then we'll open up to the audience question, and you can put it in your answer. It's this issue of heterogeneity, right? The continent with all of these challenges, and is it possible that a single list can speak to the individual issues of each country and still speak to the general issues of the entire continent? Is that possible, or is this some sort of unicorn? And then once we do that, though, then there's this question of coordination. Because there are great ideas on the continent, great ideas about what Africa's priorities should be in shaping MDBs, but like Mavis said, I would just give this anecdote that I was speaking to someone who works behind the scenes in politics here in Africa, and he said that some countries were not very excited about President Ruto's recent visit to the United States. The reason was that they felt President Ruto overstated the case for his leadership on the continent. And so they're upset, like, you know. And the point is, President Ruto didn't go to the United States representing Africa. He went to the United States representing Kenya. And he's doing everything because Kenyans voted him into office. So we run into this problem of countries acting in their national interests as individuals, but expected to prevent a united front as a continent. So how does one work with the coordination so that Kenya's priorities are reflected, but also in that reflection we see Africa's priorities? So with that, just keep that in mind when you're doing your responses. We'd like to open up to the audience now for questions. Apparently, 15 minutes to go. Sir, here and then here and there. Oh, is there a woman? Because it's all men. Let's start with him here.
Thank you very much.
Right here. She's bringing the mic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Vivek Mittal from FIDA Africa. We are a network of private sector developers and funds. We have a great working relationship with Asset. We have conducted training together. We ourselves run an accelerator for African startups in energy and infrastructure. So I'm coming from that perspective. So please don't be annoyed, and Rob may unfriend me after this. Just 2 questions. One is, do you know of any country on planet Earth that has fulfilled its needs for infrastructure and energy and development capital by using only international capital? Do you know of any? There is none. Yeah? We have to use domestic capital. And there are many other reasons for that. Second, please guess, what is the differential in capital cost, the weighted average cost of capital is a technical term, of an infrastructure and energy project in Africa compared to one in the UK or Germany or the US? Any guesses?
40%?
1%.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So we're talking about, it costs 1% more to fund a project today in Africa compared to that in Europe. So where is the problem? The problem is not in the cost of funding. The problem is not in The problem is Africans or developing nations do not do enough on their own. We need both capability and capital from the continent to engage in this. That's my
Thank you.
intervention.
This is right here and then in the back there.
Thank you for the opportunity. This is Dr. Muhammad Ishan. I am from PIDE, Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, which is a think tank of federal government of Pakistan. So I had international trade at PIDE. So as Movi said rightly that the transformation needs many challenges like diversification, export competitiveness. So we also feel the same problems in Pakistan. We have similar problems. The bigger problem in Pakistan is distortions like tax, import tariffs, and high export subsidies. So initially we used to think that import tariffs will protect domestic trade, and export subsidies they will grow more exports. But we quantify that, and we see that they cost the economy around $6 billion. It's the 1/3 of the overall FBR tax revenues. So they have high cost. I think now we are focusing on removing distortions from the country by eliminating import tariffs and export subsidies. And the second thing is, I was coming from airport last night to hotel. I had a little talk with the driver. He told me that you don't need any visa in the East African country. So you can go anywhere so it's like a big country, East Africa. So there is a big opportunity for the global value chains. The global value chain is missing. The era of export is gone. So this is the era of global value chains. There's no time you make a complete product and sell it. There's no market for that. So I think we need to focus on the global value chains as well. These were my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the gentleman there, not him. There was a hand before you, sir. Yeah. And then you.
Hey everybody, good to see you. Jeff Hall with Open Society Foundations, and I guess this is super thought-provoking, and thank you so much. And I'm embarrassed to be the third in a mantle of questions here, but I did just want to maybe ask, start with Mavis, but I'd be interested in hearing from others also. You spoke about economic transformation. I thought your example was brilliant, and I guess it sounds a lot like industrial policy to me, which has become this big thing, that we're all talking about now. And we've really been puzzling over the hypocrisy of the largest shareholders of the IFIs in the way that they're using industrial policy for their own ends. And yet, we don't really see that sort of coming into play within the IFIs themselves. And so I guess I wonder, how are you thinking about that sort of mismatch between what large shareholders are doing and what's being done by these institutions that they largely control?
Thank you very much. I'm Donald Imari from Repol. Just two quick questions. One, I've heard a lot about the issue of graduation, so the threshold is an issue. In the context of the ongoing reform, would it be, in your view, to focus, to recommend that the MDBs, particularly the World Bank, the IDA, to consider changing the threshold, the criteria, to make it more balanced scorecard, because the GNA per capita is really, to me, an artificial indicator. We have to include the number of poor people. We have to look at the elasticity of growth to poverty reduction. So that means really an indicator of structural transformation and much more. I think that's an area that I would wish to hear from you. The second one is the issue of the debt sustainability. When you look at debt ratio in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa average 42% to GDP. United States 124%. Japan 259%. But they have the capacity to repay. Nobody speaks about the sustainability or even worry about default. It's because the investment made is increasing the productive capacity of the economy, including long-term ability to repay the loans. So what can MDBs do to ensure that these loans, these concessional loans, actually increase the productive capacities of the recipient countries so that the ratios do not represent uncertainty about capacity to repay, but rather increases the productive capacity of these recipient countries? Thanks.
Thank you. And please feel free to choose what you want to respond to.
I love the way you just handed that to me. You go. Okay. So I'll try and pick up three, if possible. The first one on your point on coordination and heterogeneity, Guide. I think, look, we have an organization that represents Africa. It's supposedly the voice of Africa. Okay, so when that organization goes out there, it speaks for Africa. We have a challenge, though, with how that organization speaks for Africa because of its structure. You know, the rotating chair and the SG, etc. So we've got to really think through how we strengthen the voice for Africa. And then the thing, so I would not expect President Ruto to go to the US and speak just for Africa. I expect President Ruto to talk for Kenya, but say, in supporting Kenya, you are helping us to contribute to these value chains that will benefit these other 30 countries on the continent. So think local but act regional. So, you know, because Kenya cannot operate on its own. It needs to work with its neighbors. So whatever he's getting in America is got to benefit beyond Kenya. So that's how I would expect President Ruto to represent Africa via Kenya. But I want an entity that can go out and speak for Kenya. Very quickly, Nicholas, I saw that. Vivek, I hear you, but my question to you is, back to you, is everybody says we don't have enough fundable projects. And so all of our pension funds are invested in US stock market. So the question is, where are the fundable projects? Is it a myth? So that is just, I'm just throwing it right back at you. And then the point I wanted to really pick on is, Jeff, your point on industrial policy. It was a horrible word when I first started my career in development. No, the IFIs did not talk about industrial policy. It was corrupt. It was a bad thing. The good thing is that now everybody is talking about industrial policy, and everybody's talking about the importance of regional value chains to global value chains. What we need to do is articulate what that means in practice. For me, the risk at the moment is we're talking about industrial policy as if it's a piece of paper you write at a country level. It's not. We've got to think of real value chains that can be built to demonstrate how you build that industrial, you implement an industrial policy. So we have to be very, very intentional in articulating what a value chain looks like across 4 or 5 countries in the continent. What are the different financial instruments you need to build that value chain? What is the infrastructure? What is the cross-border issues you need to deal with? And be very intentional in supporting the building of that value chain. And if anybody wants ideas on how to do it, we've got one on textiles, we've got one on chocolate, we've got a few to share.
And just on, I'll pick up on 3 questions as well. I think the first question around the heterogeneity on the continent. I actually think it takes a committee of the willing. It never takes all of us to be ready to do everything at the same time. It takes a few countries. If we know that East Africa might lead the continent on renewable just transition, knowing that Mozambique probably has more ability to create green energy and can ship to its neighbors, we start there. We don't start with Nigeria, my wonderful country that is not quite ready. We start with the countries that are ready. So where are the committees of the willing, and can we push on that? That's why I do think Kenya being the leader on the Africa Climate Summit is important, and it's significant, and it's telling us that there's something happening in East Africa. So I think we have to continue to look for those pockets that emerge and see how they lead. On thank you for sharing the story of Pakistan and the distortion in the market. I think it's instructive for us, given how similar a lot of the economies on the continent are with that in Pakistan. Jeff, on your question, I think there's something else around voice. In my time working in advocacy, I feel like there's a coming of age where African leaders' voices are asking for more space, and the voice calls out duplicity, it calls out sort of misalignment, and I think we need to keep doing that, to say, well, you're saying this here, but not doing this there. So my push is for us to continue to identify areas of misalignment, especially when they adversely impact African countries, and to call that out, at least shine the light on that. And lastly, on MDBs and their ability to, on debt sustainability, one of the good things about ADF is it focuses on three significant areas. One is debt sustainability for African countries. That's why replenishing it at scale, it really is important for many countries. The second is it invests in areas that enhance productivity. So food security is one, infrastructure is another. I think ADF has a lot more crystal clear pulse on the needs of the continent as a region and tries to funnel some funds, while it is still demand-driven, towards areas that can produce, because the point of this is to leverage, ensure that these funds can leverage more productivity in the continent. And on bankable products, again, ADF is one of those funds that actually helps countries to prepare projects so that there is a pipeline of bankable products. So I think that there's MDBs already doing that work in some ways. I think it's maybe scale, and we need to do more of it.
Okay, I'm going to take two of the questions as well. And then come to the coordination one. So I'll be quite brief. Just in terms of the thresholds and debt sustainability, I think yes, there's so many calls for change. We, Development Reimagined, have quite a few papers on debt sustainability in particular, on how that could be better reflected for African countries to enable, unconstrain countries in their ability to access finance. But I think generally, and again, being here at AFDB, I do think there's a potential for the African Development Bank to be leading the way in some of these issues. So again, because there are, a lot of African countries who are represented on the board still, and they can actually use that voice, and again, with the technical people behind it, can actually provide the way for other MDBs to follow on some of these issues around graduation and debt sustainability, some of the other tech issues. Just coming back on the point on infrastructure, I think in no way would I suggest that it would only be important to have external finance supporting infrastructure. Of course, domestic finance should come in. But I guess it's a question of, again, economists' way of thinking, opportunity cost. So if in domestic finance, ideally should at least fund recurrent expenditure. If it can fund capital expenditure, great, if there's enough. If there's not, then that's where you go to external finance, ideally. That would be just a kind of a very simple model of thinking about it. And I think there are many countries who've used that model at least. But also, I don't think we need to be constrained by experience in the past. I don't think Chinese economy or the tiger economies were constrained by the experience of the past. We can actually create a new model, but again, we have to be, and using the word that Mavis used, intentional about it, and be very planned and strategic about it. So hopefully that's something that we can work on to meet our needs. Last but not least, on coordination. Coordination, again, runs through all of our work at DR. One of the things we try to do is create those spaces and platforms for coordination of African governments, especially in other countries who, like China, for example. But I think one of the key challenges with coordination and the heterogeneity issue is, of course, that they're just not, although there are a lot of spaces for that to happen, there's a lot of duplication. And so is there a way that, and again, like what Sarah was saying, can you have certain countries or groups of countries lead on particular issues internationally, take those forward where they feel really passionate about, and
let's say a visit like Ruto's visit to the US, ideally what happens prior to that visit is some consultation with other countries to say, hey, what would you like us to get out of this? I've got this opportunity, it's a state visit. But, you know, those things could happen over time, but we just need to create the spaces for them.
Thank you, and please give the panelists a hand of applause. And ladies, thank you very much. I think this is instructive. This is very inspirational, and it should guide our discussions for the rest of the day. We're going to take a break now until 10:30. There's tea and coffee outside. When you come back, we'll have 2 breakout sessions. One will be here on the recipient perspectives of donor landscapes, and the other will be in the Hemingway room on G20 implication for Brazil's presidency and the new AU membership. That's it? Yeah, all right. So thank you. And you have tea and coffee until 10:30.